She thought spraying my service dog with chemicals would scare me into silence. What she didn't realize was that one careless act had crossed a line so serious it stopped even the police in their tracks. I had dealt with fines, threats, and petty rules before, but this wasn't just another HOA power game. This was personal. And it was criminal. When the cops showed up and told her exactly what law she had broken, her face drained of every ounce of arrogance. What happens when the enforcer suddenly becomes the offender? For years, my home was supposed to be my sanctuary. I had chosen this neighborhood for its quiet streets, its neat little lawns, and the sense of safety it promised. It wasn't the fanciest community, but it was stable, and that stability mattered more than anything. My service dog, a loyal companion trained to help me manage daily challenges, became part of that rhythm. Together, we walked the sidewalks, waved at passing cars, and lived without stepping on anyone's toes. At first, the HOA seemed like a background presence. Letters tucked into mailboxes about lawn heights, recycling schedules, and neighborhood block parties. I paid little attention. Rules were rules, and as long as they didn't interfere with how I lived, I didn't see the harm. But beneath the surface of manicured hedges and polite smiles, there was something else brewing. The kind of tension that only appears when authority meets entitlement. First, cold glare from Delilah outside the HOA clubhouse. It started small. A cold stare from a board member as I walked my dog past the clubhouse. A passive-aggressive comment about leash length when my dog sat patiently by my side. I brushed it off. After all, every neighborhood has its busybodies, the ones who believe their opinions carry more weight than anyone else's. But in this community, that authority wasn't just in their words. It was written into the bylaws, stamped, into the HOA fines, and carried with an almost obsessive pride. And one woman in particular seemed determined to make me her personal project. She watched, she whispered, and she waited for me to slip up. Back then, I had no idea just how far she would go. I didn't know that her obsession with power and control would one day cross into something much darker, something that put not just my peace but my service dog's safety at risk. What looked like ordinary neighborhood politics was about to unravel into something criminal. The first letter from the HOA was almost laughable. It accused me of failing to maintain community standards because my dog's water bowl, which I kept by the porch, was supposedly an eyesore, a bowl of water, for a service animal. I remember standing there with the letter in hand, blinking at the absurdity. Most people would have tossed it aside, and I almost did. But something in the tone, the smug official phrasing, made it clear. This wasn't just a friendly reminder. This was the beginning. Within weeks, the letters multiplied. One claimed my dog's occasional barking violated noise ordinances, even though he barked less than the yapping terriers 2 houses down. Another accused me of walking him on improper pathways, as if the sidewalk suddenly belonged to a select few. Each notice came with the same threat in bold at the bottom. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. At first, I told myself it wasn't personal, just bureaucracy, just some rule stickler with too much time. But then I noticed a pattern. Every time I took my service dog outside, a figure lingered nearby, a woman from the board. Her name was whispered with irritation throughout the neighborhood, but no one ever confronted her. She thrived on fear, on her ability to weaponize the rulebook. And now, she had chosen me. The harassment escalated quickly. Fines for imaginary violations began stacking up, each one mailed with the cold efficiency of a machine. They demanded hundreds of dollars for unauthorized structures, which turned out to be the removable shade tent I used during hot days so my dog wouldn't overheat. They cited me for unsightly debris, when a small bag of dog waste was tied neatly for trash collection, sitting outside for all of 10 minutes. Every letter carried the same weight: intimidation. And the more I ignored them, the bolder they became. What started as paperwork turned into surveillance. I'd catch her peering out from behind her blinds, or worse, standing at the edge of my property with her phone angled toward me. It was as if she was documenting my every move, waiting for the slightest mistake to add to her growing case file. I wasn't the only one. Quiet whispers reached me from other residents. An elderly man fined for having a flag slightly larger. Then regulation size, a single mother penalized because her child's bike leaned against their garage door. But no one fought back. The board had a reputation for dragging dissenters through costly arbitration, draining their energy and wallets, until they caved. Fear had silenced the neighborhood, but I wasn't so easy to intimidate. Still, the real breaking point came the day I noticed my service dog limping. At first, I thought he had twisted a paw, but then I found residue on his fur, a strange chemical smell that stung my eyes. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an accident. Someone had sprayed him. The vet confirmed my worst fear. He'd been exposed to a harmful substance, likely some form of cleaning chemical or pesticide. He would recover, but the message was clear. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was targeted, malicious. When I confronted the board, they brushed me off with cold indifference. Without evidence, they said. There's nothing to investigate. I could see the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth as she repeated those words, as though daring me to prove it. So I did. I invested in cameras, motion sensors, a small but effective surveillance system that caught every shadow, every movement, near my home, and within days the truth began to unravel. There she was, caught on camera, creeping up to my property at night, shaking something from a spray bottle near the porch where my dog rested. But it didn't stop there. The footage also revealed her petty sabotage, kicking over the water bowl, tearing notices off my door so I couldn't respond on time, even planting debris in my yard just to photograph it later as evidence. I wanted to scream, to confront her on the spot, but I knew better. I kept collecting. Each recording became another nail in her coffin, another undeniable piece of proof. And while I gathered evidence, the harassment only grew. Notices arrived almost daily now. Threats of escalating fines, warnings of legal action, even letters implying they could seize my property if I didn't comply. The more she pushed, the more my resolve hardened. What she didn't know was that every intimidation tactic, every act of cruelty was being carefully documented. Every time she thought she was tightening the noose, she was only tying it around her own neck. But the moment that shifted everything, the moment this petty neighborhood war turned into something far bigger, happened one humid evening when the cops were called to my door. She had filed a complaint, claiming I was keeping a dangerous animal on the property. I stood there, stunned, leash in hand, as officers assessed my calm, trained service dog like he was some kind of threat. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought they might believe her, but then I handed over the vet report. The photos, the surveillance footage, and what I saw next, I'll never forget. The officers' tone changed instantly. Their questions stopped being directed at me, and started being aimed at her. The longer they watched the footage, the paler her face became. She had overplayed her hand, and for the first time the law wasn't on her side, and that was when they told her something she clearly hadn't expected. Spraying a service animal wasn't just cruel. It wasn't just a violation of HOA rules, it was a federal crime. The night the truth came crashing down wasn't planned. It unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck, every detail seared into memory. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting, no doubt expecting another round of public shaming, this time aimed squarely at me. I walked in with my head high, clutching the thick folder I had been building for months. The room buzzed with whispers as neighbors filled the chairs, most of them there out of obligation, some out of curiosity. At the front, she sat perched like a queen on her throne, the very woman who had turned my life into a war zone. Her smug grin said it all. She thought tonight would end with my defeat. But she didn't know what I had brought with me. When the meeting began, she wasted no time. She launched into a tirade about community standards, unsanitary conditions, and dangerous animals. Each word dripped with venom, each accusation twisting reality until even the most absurd claims sounded rehearsed. Papers slapped against the table. Photographs, staged, manipulated, were waved like evidence in a trial, and for a moment the room was silent, hanging on her every manufactured detail. That's when I stood. My voice didn't need to be loud. Calm, steady, and precise. That was enough. One by one, I laid my evidence on the table. Letters, photos, vet reports, and then the final blow, the video footage. The screen lit up with undeniable proof. Grainy at first, but clear enough to recognize her creeping across my property. Bottle in hand, spraying the porch, spraying near the dog, shoving debris into my yard, and then turning back to her house with that same cold satisfaction she always wore in public. The room shifted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraped against the floor. Her face went from smug certainty to a mask of pure panic. For the first time, she had nowhere to hide. I didn't need to raise my voice. The footage spoke louder than anything I could have said. Every neighbor who had doubted me now stared at her in disgust. The board members who once nodded along with her every accusation avoided her eyes. She had gone from enforcer to criminal in the span of minutes. And then, just when she opened her mouth to spin another lie, the police stepped forward. They had been watching quietly from the back of the room, waiting for the right moment. Their words cut through the tension like a blade. "You're under investigation for the harassment and endangerment of a service animal. This isn't just an HOA matter. This is a federal offense." The color drained from her face. Her papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the floor like the flimsy weapons they were. The same woman who had strutted into my life with threats and fines now sat frozen, speechless as the law she had twisted to her advantage finally turned on her. In that moment, the power shifted. Years of fear, manipulation, and petty tyranny collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. She wasn't the victimizer anymore. She was the one exposed, cornered, and powerless. And as the officers led her away, the neighborhood erupted, not in cheers, not in chaos, but in a stunned silence that carried more weight than any celebration. People looked at me differently. Not as a rule breaker, but as someone who had stood against the storm and refused to bow. For the first time, the HOA's grip on the community cracked, but this story didn't end with her humiliation in that room. The fallout was only beginning. The silence in that meeting room lingered long after she was escorted out. It was the kind of silence that comes when a community suddenly sees itself in the mirror. The rules, the fear, the misplaced loyalty to authority. All of it exposed. For years, people had whispered about her behavior, about the board's heavy-handed ways, but no one had dared to speak up. Now, the truth was undeniable, played out in front of everyone on a glowing screen. When the police left with her, I gathered my papers calmly, even as my hands trembled with the release of months of pent-up frustration. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was something heavier. The weight of knowing that one battle was over, but the war with the HOA machine was far from finished. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled across the neighborhood like a stone cast into still water. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped me on walks to apologize. An older couple down the street admitted they had been fined over their bird feeder, but never fought back because they feared retaliation. A single father told me he'd considered moving after his teenage son received threats for parking in front of his own house. The stories poured out, and with each one the picture became clearer. It hadn't just been me. She had terrorized nearly everyone in some way. And yet, for all the harm she caused, there was something almost liberating about the collapse of her authority. People began to question the board. Meetings that once felt like courtroom trials turned into open forums. Neighbors raised their Hands not to nod in silent agreement, but to challenge, to demand transparency. For the first time, the HOA board was on the defensive. But there was also the legal side, the part that couldn't be swept under the rug with apologies or quiet resignations. Federal law doesn't look kindly on those who harm service animals. The investigation stretched on for weeks, drawing in attorneys, reporters, and government agencies. Each new headline chipped away at her carefully cultivated facade of control. HOA president under investigation for harassment. Service dog attack sparks federal case. She went from ruling the neighborhood with fear to being whispered about in grocery store aisles and shunned at community events. For me, it was never about revenge. It was about accountability, about drawing a line in the sand that said, "This, far, no further." Watching her face the consequences didn't erase the damage, but it did something almost more important. It sent a message. The message was simple. You can push people. You can bully them with rules and threats. But when you cross into cruelty, when you target the defenseless, there is no shield strong enough to protect you. Over time, the neighborhood itself began to heal. The fines slowed, the nitpicking letters stopped arriving, and the surveillance I had grown so used to melted into normalcy. My service dog walked proudly again, tail high, greeted by neighbors, who now saw him as a symbol of resilience rather than a target. The fear that had once shadowed every walk through the neighborhood began to lift. The HOA board tried to quietly distance itself from her. Some members resigned, citing stress or personal reasons. Others stayed but spoke with less conviction, their authority dulled by association. Eventually, a vote was called. For the first time in years, new members were elected. People who wanted fairness, not power trips. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for her, the legal system did what it does. There were hearings, statements, endless paperwork. She pled, she stalled, she tried to twist the narrative, but the evidence was ironclad. What she had done wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. The final outcome included fines, mandatory community service, and a permanent stain on her record. She would never hold a position of authority in an HOA again. But here's the part I never expected. Her downfall changed the culture of the community itself. People who had once lived in quiet submission now spoke openly. Neighbors helped each, other more. Rules were enforced with common sense rather than malice. And somewhere along the way, the community began to feel like a neighborhood again, not a dictatorship. For me, the personal victory wasn't about seeing her punished. It was in reclaiming the peace I had been robbed of, walking out my front door without scanning for eyes at the blinds, setting out a water bowl for my service dog without worrying it would be kicked over, living without the constant weight of intimidation pressing against every choice. That peace was worth more than any headline, more than any apology. But if there's one takeaway I want anyone listening to understand, it's this. Power in the wrong hands doesn't just write fines or send letters. It corrodes communities. It isolates good people. It makes neighbors into enemies and strips away trust. And the only way to stop it is to stand up, even when your voice shakes, even when you're standing alone at first. Because here's the truth. I wasn't alone. Not really. Others had suffered. Others had wanted to fight back. All it took was one person refusing to bow, and suddenly, silence broke. Courage spreads. Looking back now, I don't think of this story as one about an HOA board or a cruel woman with too much power. I think of it as a story about resilience, about drawing strength from injustice, and about the quiet triumph of holding your ground. And as I sit on my porch today, watching my service dog stretch out lazily in the sun, I can't help but ask, how many communities are still living under the shadow of someone like her? How many stories go untold because people are too afraid to fight? Maybe this one will inspire someone else to stand up. Maybe it will make a neighbor question the rules being shoved down their throat. Or maybe, just maybe, It will remind someone. The justice isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to be silent. The HOA thought they could break me with fines, with rules, with fear. But in the end, all they did was show me how strong I could be when I had something worth protecting. And that strength, that refusal to surrender, is something no rulebook, no bully, and no corrupt board can ever take away.